The heat in Oakhaven was not merely a condition of the weather, but a malicious entity, a suffocating blanket of dry misery that pressed against the rough-hewn timber of the courthouse until the very sap boiled within the wood and the iron nails groaned in their sockets, a relentless atmospheric pressure that seemed intent on crushing the spirit of every soul foolish enough to draw a breath within the valley as parched embrace. Judge Malachi Thorne sat behind the high bench, a structure of dark polished mahogany that looked less like a seat of justice and more like a pulpit for the damned, his knuckles white as exposed bone where they gripped the armrests, the ancient leather creaking softly, almost imperceptibly, beneath the trembling tension of his grip. He was a man carved from the same jagged granite that formed the canyon walls outside, his face a road map of eroded canyons and deep fissures where shadows pooled like stagnant water, his eyes two chips of flint that had long ago ceased to reflect anything but the harsh, unforgiving glare of the law. The courtroom was packed a sweltering tin of sardines, where the stench of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco smoke, and the metallic tang of fear mingled into a thick, palpable miasma that coated the back of Thorne's throat with the taste of copper and ash. Every seat was taken, every inch of standing room occupied by the townsfolk of Oakhaven, their faces slick with sweat and grease, their eyes fixed on the man in the iron shackles, standing in the center of the room. A young drifter named Elias Vane, who had the misfortune of riding into town on a horse that looked too fine for his saddle, and possessing a pistol that had allegedly fired the shot which ended the life of the mayor's son during a drunken dispute at the Saloon of Lost Souls 3 nights prior. The air was thick with the droning buzz of a solitary fat bluebottle fly that circled the room in lazy, erratic loops its wings, beating a hypnotic rhythm against the suffocating silence, the only sound daring to compete with the heavy rhythmic thudding of the tough grandfather clock that stood like a coffin in the corner, marking the seconds of a life that hung in the balance of Thorne's impending words. Thorne felt the weight of the gavel resting on the blotter before him, the handle worn smooth by decades of verdicts, the wood stained with the invisible blood of 100 men sent to the gallows, and for the first time in his 40 years on the bench, the instrument felt not like an extension of his arm, but like a leaden weight, a cursed object that burned his skin even without touching it. He knew the truth, a truth that gnawed at his gut like a starving rat. He had seen the evidence, the inconsistent testimony of the witnesses who had been bought with silver coins and promises of favor. The missing gun that had miraculously appeared in Vane's saddlebag hours after the arrest, the way the mayor sat in the front row fanning himself with a silk handkerchief, his eyes hard and expectant, demanding a sacrifice to wash away the shame of his son's own corruption. Vane was innocent of the murder guilty, perhaps of being a fool and a vagrant, but not a killer, yet the town of Oakhaven did not want justice. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted the catharsis of a rope snapping a neck to break the monotony of the heat and the slow decay of their lives. Thorne shifted in his chair, the wool of his robe itching against his neck, a collar of fire that threatened to choke him, and he looked into the eyes of Elias Vane, expecting to see terror begging or the wild desperation of a trapped animal, but instead finding a calm abyssal silence, a resignation that was more terrifying than any scream. Vane's eyes were the color of the storm clouds that never came gray and deep, and they held a mirror up to Thorne, reflecting the judge's own hollow soul back at him, stripping away the pomp and circumstance of the court to reveal the rotting moral framework beneath. The fly landed on the rim of the inkwell, rubbing its legs together with methodical precision, and Thorne watched it, fixating on the iridescent sheen of its wings to avoid the crushing weight of the mayor's stare, the heavy expectation of the railroad tycoons in the back, the silent plea of the law books stacked like tombstones to his left. He remembered the oath he had sworn, the words of scripture and statute that he had memorized and recited, but those words felt brittle now, crumbling like dry leaves in the furnace of the courtroom. If he let the boy go, the town would riot, the mayor would ensure Thorne's ruin, the delicate peace of Oakhaven would shatter into chaos. But if he condemned him, he would be driving the final nail into the coffin of his own salvation, severing the last tether that bound him to the concept of righteousness. The silence stretched, becoming a physical thing, a taut wire pulled to the breaking point, humming with the tension of 100 held breaths. Thorne's hand moved a slow, arthritic claw, detaching from the armrest, hovering over the gavel, his fingers trembling with a palsy. that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the seismic fracture occurring within his spirit. He could feel the grain of the wood as his fingers closed around the handle, the sensation cool and hard, an anchor in the storm of his mind. He looked once more at Vane, and the boy nodded, a microscopic movement, a gesture of forgiveness or perhaps a curse, an acknowledgement that he understood the game was rigged and the dealer was crooked. That nod broke something inside Thorne, a vital strut in the architecture of his conscience, snapping with a soundless violence that reverberated through his entire skeletal structure. He lifted the gavel, the movement heavy and sluggish as if moving through water, and the room seemed to tilt, the shadows lengthening, the faces of the crowd distorting into grotesque masks of hungry anticipation. The clock ticked, the fly buzzed. The sweat dripped from his brow onto the parchment of the verdict. With a surge of self-loathing that tasted like bile, Thorne brought the gavel down, not with the sharp crack of authority, but with a dull, thunderous thud that sounded like a shovel striking the earth of a fresh grave, the sound rippling through the stagnant air, shattering the silence, shattering the illusion of justice, and shattering the man named Malachi Thorne, leaving behind only a husk in a black robe. "Guilty," he croaked, his voice a stranger's rasp, dry as the dust outside. And as the word left his lips, the fracture was complete, the world of Oakhaven shifting imperceptibly on its axis, tilting toward a darkness that would soon consume them all, starting with the man who had just sold his soul for the price of a quiet afternoon. The gavel did not merely strike the sounding block. It shattered the fragile, suspended reality of the courtroom, a sharp, wooden thunderclap that seemed to sever the very threads of destiny holding the accused man's soul to the earthly plane, reverberating through the stagnant, heat-choked air like a gunshot in a canyon, signaling not just the end of a trial, but the commencement of a profound and terrifying isolation that descended instantly upon the chamber. The silence that followed was not empty but heavy, a physical weight that pressed against the eardrums, composed of 100 held breaths and the sudden sickening realization that mercy had fled this valley long ago, leaving behind only the desiccated husk of the law and the man who wielded it like a butcher's cleaver. Judge Malachi Thorne remained motionless, his hand still resting on the handle of the gavel, his knuckles white as exposed bone against the dark. Mahogany, his eyes 2 chips of flint, devoid of any spark of humanity, staring down from the elevated bench which loomed like a pulpit of damnation, over the trembling figure of the drifter or boy really whose name had been muttered, but already forgotten erased by the magnitude of the sentence just pronounced. The dust motes, caught in the shafts of brutal yellow sunlight that pierced the grime-streaked windows, danced violently in the wake of the sound, swirling in chaotic vortexes around the prisoner's head like tiny, mocking spirits waiting to escort him to the void, while the heat, that relentless, malevolent entity which had plagued Oakhaven for months, seemed to intensify, boiling the sweat on the back of the neck, turning the courtroom into a kiln where hope was fired until it cracked and crumbled into ash. Thorne watched the color drain from the boy's face, observing the physiological betrayal of the body with the detached curiosity of a vivisectionist, noting how the pupils dilated until the eyes were black pits of terror, how the Adam's apple bobbed convulsively in a throat parched by fear, and the dry alkaline dust that coated every surface in the town. There was no outcry from the gallery, no weeping mother or shouting father, for the boy was a stranger, a piece of driftwood, washed up on the shores of this cursed town, and the townsfolk, packed shoulder to shoulder on the uncomfortable splintering benches, were not there to offer support, but to witness the ritual drawn by a morbid gravity, to see the machinery of Thorne's justice grind another life into dust. They sat in a stupor of complicity, their faces slick with perspiration, their eyes darting away from the condemned man, abandoning him to his fate in a collective act of spiritual cowardice that was as palpable as the smell of unwashed bodies and stale tobacco smoke that permeated the room. Thorne felt this abandonment, tasted it on his tongue like copper. He knew that by condemning this man, he was also severing the town's last link to grace, forcing them to participate in a cruelty so absolute that it bound them to him, making them extensions of his will-silent partners in the grim business of purging the world of its chaotic elements. The bailiff, a man of profound girth and minimal imagination, moved with the lumbering slowness of an inevitable landslide. The jingling of the iron keys at his belt cutting through the silence, a sound that rang with the finality of a funeral toll. He approached the prisoner, whose knees had buckled, leaving him supported only by the grip of the wooden railing, his knuckles raw, his fingernails digging into the grain as if he could anchor himself to life through sheer friction. Thorne's voice, when he finally spoke again to dismiss the court, was a rasp of dry leaves dragging over, stone a sound devoid of moisture or pity, instructing the sheriff to take the prisoner to the holding cell to await the dawn, a dawn the boy would see only through the narrow barred slit of a window before the rope claimed him. The scraping of chair legs against the floorboards as the gallery rose to leave was a chaotic discordant symphony, a rush of movement as the people sought to escape the suffocating orbit of the judge's gaze, to flee back into the blinding sun where they could pretend that what had happened in this room was necessary, righteous, inevitable. But Thorne did not move. He remained seated, a statue carved from judgment, and shadows watching the room empty until only the dust remained settling slowly onto the empty benches derailing the floor, bearing the memory of the boy's plea, covering the stains of the past. The boy was dragged out, his boots scuffing uselessly against the floor, his whimpering silenced by the heavy oak doors slamming shut, a sound that sealed the courthouse in a tomb-like quiet. Now alone, Thorne allowed his shoulders to slump, just a fraction, the weight of his robe feeling like lead, a garment woven from the sins of the hundreds he had sent to the gallows, a mantle he wore with a grim, masochistic pride. He looked around the empty room, the peeling paint, the warped floorboards, the portraits of long-dead, grim-faced men on the walls, and felt a profound echoing hollowness within his own chest, a cavernous space where a heart might once have beaten, now filled only with the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the relentless throbbing heat. He had abandoned the boy to death, yes, but more significantly, he had abandoned himself to this role, surrendered his own humanity to become the instrument of a harsh, Old Testament God who demanded blood for order. He stood up slowly, his joints popping, the sound loud in the emptiness, and walked to the window, peering out through the distorted glass at the street below where the townsfolk dispersed like ants under a magnifying glass, heads down, avoiding each other's eyes, carrying the weight of the verdict home to their dinner tables, where it would sit like a stone in their bellies. The town of Oakhaven lay stretched out before him, bleached and broken, a collection of ramshackle buildings clinging to the edge of the desert, abandoned by the rain, abandoned by prosperity, and now, under his gavel, abandoned by mercy. Thorne placed his hand against the hot glass, feeling the burn, desiring the pain to remind him he was still flesh and blood, though he felt increasingly like the dry timber of the courthouse itself, petrified and unyielding. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the dusty street like the grasping fingers of the dead, reaching for the courthouse, reaching for him. He turned away from the light, retreating back into the shadows of his chambers, the smell of old paper and leather surrounding him, a sanctuary of statutes and codes where emotions were irrelevant, where the only truth was the written law and the swift drop of the rope. In the silence of the empty building, the abandonment was complete. There was no God in Oakhaven, only Judge Malachi Thorne, and in the encroaching dark he sat alone at his desk pouring a glass of whiskey. That looked like liquid amber in the dim light, drinking it not for pleasure, but to wash away the taste of the dust, the taste of the boys. Fear the taste of his own damnable solitary power. The transition from the sepulchral gloom of the courthouse to the blinding white-hot anvil of the midday sun was not merely a change in lighting, but a violent assault on the senses, a physical blow that struck the condemned man. Elias Thorne, no relation to the judge, save for the shared lineage of dust and sin, with the force of a sledgehammer, causing him to stagger upon the threshold as the heavy oak doors swung outward with a groan that sounded suspiciously like a death rattle, exposing him to the merciless scrutiny of a town that had gathered not with the raucous energy of a mob, but with the silent, terrifying patience of vultures waiting for the final twitch of a dying animal. The air outside was arguably worse than the stagnant soup within the chamber, for here the heat was dynamic, a living, breathing predator that clawed at the throat and dried the moisture from the eyes before a tear could fully form, turning the world into a shimmering, distorted watercolor painting of browns and bleached yellows where nothing felt solid except the iron shackles that bound Elias. Ankles and wrists, their weight suddenly amplified by the gravity of his sentence, pulling him downward toward the earth that seemed eager to reclaim his bones. Judge Malachi Thorne emerged from the shadows of the vestibule a moment later, his black robes drinking in the sunlight without reflecting a single photon, a void in the shape of a man who moved with a terrifying, fluid grace that belied his age, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a hat that cast a permanent eclipse over his features, watching the prisoner's faltering steps with the dispassionate curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen pinned to a board. The bailiff, a man of considerable girth whose sweat-stained shirt clung to him like a second skin, gave Elias a shove that was less an act of aggression and more a necessary transfer of momentum to overcome the inertia of despair, sending the prisoner stumbling down the 3 wooden steps of the courthouse porch, his boots skidding on the dry rotted planks, the sound of his chains clattering against the wood echoing across the town square like the chaotic chiming of a leper's bell. This was the beginning of the crawl, a procession that was theoretically only a few hundred yards to the waiting holding cell or the scaffold depending on the expediency of the carpenter. But in the warped perception of the doom, it stretched out into an infinite horizon of suffering, a vast desert of time and space that had to be traversed inch by agonizing inch. Elias did not walk so much as he was dragged by the invisible current of his fate, his legs heavy as lead, his spirit already broken by the gavel strike. And as his knees buckled upon hitting the hard-packed dirt of the main street, the crowd did not gasp or jeer. They simply watched, their faces masks of grim satisfaction or morbid fascination, their eyes tracking the puff of dust that rose around the fallen man like a phantom escaping the soil. He tried to rise, but the chains were too short, the heat too oppressive, and the gaze of the judge too heavy pressing down on his spine like a physical weight, forcing him to scramble on all fours, his fingers digging into the hot earth, scraping against buried stones and the detritus of civilization, shards of glass, spent casings, the dried spittle of horses. Wow. The iron cuffs bit into his wrist, grinding against the bone until a trickle of blood began to map a red river through the dirt on his skin. Judge Thorne did not hurry him. Indeed, the judge stopped on the bottom step of the courthouse, lighting a cigar with slow, deliberate movements, the flare of the match invisible in the sun, but the smoke rising in a perfect blue-gray plume that drifted lazily over the scene, a signal that he controlled not just the law, but the very pacing of reality itself, allowing the prisoner to degrade himself in the dirt, to become something less than human before the rope even touched his neck. The silence of Oakhaven was absolute, broken only by the rasp of Elias's breath, which sounded like a saw cutting through wet wood, and the dragging sound of the chain linking his ankles, a metallic snake leaving a furrow in the road that marked his progress in inches. To the onlookers, the crawl was a piece of theater, a morality play enacted in real time, where the villain was stripped of his bravado and reduced to a crawling beast. But to Malachi Thorne, it was a necessary purification, a belief that the soul must be humbled, pulverized, and dragged through the mire of its own making before it could be extinguished, that the physical degradation was merely a mirror of the spiritual rot he had sentenced. Elias pushed himself forward, his vision swimming in a haze of red and gold, the buildings on either side of the street looming over him like canyon walls, the faces of the townsfolk blurring into a singular multi-eyed monster that judged him without mercy. He could feel the heat radiating from the ground through the fabric of his trousers, searing his skin, the dust clogging his nostrils, and coating his tongue with the taste of copper and ancient earth, a taste that reminded him of graves and forgotten cellars. Every movement was a negotiation with pain. The muscles in his back spasmed, the shackles chafed raw skin, and the sun hammered the back of his neck, a relentless pressure that whispered to him to simply lie down, to stop moving, to let the earth swallow him whole right there in the middle of the street. But the bailiff's boot nudged his ribs, not hard but insistent, a reminder that the state's machinery would not be halted by mere exhaustion. And so the crawl continued, a grotesque pantomime of life's struggle, moving from the shadow of the law toward the shadow of death. Judge Thorne began to walk, then his boots striking the earth with a rhythmic hollow thud that seemed to sync with the beating of a hoof. Elias's terrified heart following the trail of disturbed dust and blood drops. A dark shepherd driving his lamb toward the slaughter, his face impassive, his mind a fortress of legalistic absolute where pity was a structural weakness that had been bricked over decades ago. The distance to the jailhouse was a gauntlet of humiliation. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, a lonely, jagged sound that pierced the thick air, and a shutter banged in the windless heat, ghosts of sound that emphasized the unnatural quiet of the humanity present. Elias looked up once, his eyes wild and rimmed with red dust, locking gaze with a woman in a bonnet who stood by the general store, pleading silently for a shred of recognition, acknowledgement of his humanity, but she turned her face away, pulling her child closer, denying him even that small comfort, reinforcing the isolation that the judge had decreed. The crawl became a blur of repetition, hand forward, knee forward, drag, clink, gaspa, cycle of misery that erased the past and the future, leaving only the torture of the eternal present where the sun never moved, and the destination never seemed to get closer. The sweat poured off Elias, turning the dust on his face to mud, creating a mask of tragedy that hid his features, transforming him into an archetype of the damned, a gargoyle animated by fear and forced to crawl across the burning earth. Thorne watched the transformation with a cold satisfaction, noting how the pride that had held Elias's chin high in the courtroom had evaporated, replaced by the primal instinct to survive the next second, to simply draw the next breath, proving Thorne's long-held theory that all men, when stripped of their pretenses and subjected to the raw power of the law and the elements, were nothing more than mud and fear waiting to be returned to the void. The jailhouse finally loomed ahead, a squat, stone structure that seemed to have grown out of the ground like a tumor, its barred windows, dark eyes staring blindly into the light. And as Elias reached the shadow cast by its wall, he collapsed, his strength finally severe, lying panting in the dirt, a heap of broken humanity at the feet of the institution that would end him. Judge Thorne arrived a moment later, his shadow falling over Elias, cooling him not with relief, but with the chill of the grave. And as the judge looked down at the prostrate figure, he did not speak, did not offer a word of finality, but simply gestured to the bailiff with a flick of his cigar ash, a silent command to drag the meat into the locker, signaling that the crawl was over, but the true darkness was only just beginning. The sun began its bloody descent behind the jagged teeth of the western peaks, painting the sky in bruises of violaceous purple and clots of crimson, signaling the hour when the gavel of the day was finally laid to rest, and the far more brutal court of the night convened its session among the shadows and the scorpions, a transition that Judge Malachi Thorne observed with the dispassionate gaze of a man who recognized that the darkness was not an adversary, but a colleague, a necessary shroud under which the true work of the law could be executed without the interfering glare of the sun or the weeping eyes of the town's faint-hearted populace. Having shed the heavy black robes that smelled of stale tobacco, old paper, and the accumulated misery of 1,000 petty crimes, Malachi now donned a different sort of vestment, a long duster of oiled canvas that whispered against his legs like a conspirator. The fabric stiff with the accumulation of road dust and the dried fluids of past judgments rendered in lead rather than ink, and he pulled the brim of his hat low over eyes that had long ago lost the capacity for surprise or pity, eyes that were now fixed on the singular geometric certainty of the trail leading out of Oakhaven. He approached his horse, a massive gelding the color of a moonless midnight named Absalom, a beast that did not whinny or stamp, but stood with the uncanny, predatory stillness of a statue carved from volcanic rock, its muscles coiling beneath the sleek hide like steel cables under tension, waiting for the burden of the law to settle upon its back. And as Malachi swung into the saddle, the leather creaked with a sound like the groaning of a dying tree, a sonic punctuation mark that ended the time of deliberation and began the time of enforcement. Leaving Oakhaven was not merely a departure, but an excision, the judge riding out past the last leaning shacks, where the lantern light flickered with the fear of those huddled inside, knowing that the rider passing their windows was not merely a man, but a mechanism of fate set into irrevocable motion, a force that rendered the wilderness not as a place of freedom, but as a vast open-air dungeon from which there was no parole. The tracks of Elias Thorne were distinct in the shifting sands and the hard-packed caliche of frantic scrawled desperation that told a story of stumbling panic to the judge's practiced eye, revealing a man whose lungs were burning with the furnace air and whose mind was fracturing under the weight of the verdict. The footprints digging deep at the toes and dragging at the heels, a erratic gait that spoke of a soul looking constantly over its shoulder at the ghost of retribution that he knew was following. Malachi did not need to hurry, for the judge understood the geography of fear better than any surveyor understood the lay of the land, knowing with absolute conviction that terror exhausts the soul faster than a gallop exhausts a steed, and that the anticipation of the bullet is often more crippling than the lead itself. So he kept Absalom at a steady rhythmic trot that ate up the miles with mechanical efficiency, the iron shoes, striking sparks against the flinty ground, tiny fleeting stars that died as quickly as hope in the Badlands. The desert floor was a graveyard of ancient oceans crunching under the hooves, the silence absolute and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic hypnotic cadence of the pursuit, a sound that must have traveled on the wind to the ears of the condemned like the ticking of a doomsday clock reverberating off the canyon walls that rose up on either side like the pillars of a ruined cathedral, their strata glowing red and orange in the dying light as if the stone itself were burning from within. To Malachi, this was the purest form of jurisprudence, for the courtroom was theater, a place of words and papers and performative civility, but the high desert was the crucible where truth was distilled from the blood, where the arguments were stripped away until only the raw, shivering meat of the sinner remained exposed to the elements and the inevitable consequence of their transgression. As the light fell completely and the stars emerged like cold, indifferent eyes watching a gladiator pit from the safety of the heavens, the temperature plummeted, the oppressive heat of the day evaporating into the ether to be replaced by a biting chill that sought the marrow of the bone. Yet the judge felt neither cold nor heat, insulated by the absolute certainty of his righteousness and the burning coal of duty that sat in his chest where a heart might have been in a lesser man. He reached down to touch the stock of the Winchester in the scabbard, the wood smooth and cool to the touch, familiar as a lover's hand, a gavel that could strike across canyons, an instrument that delivered the final sentence without the possibility of appeal, and he slipped the leather thong off the hammer, the metallic click sounding impossibly loud in the vast, echoing emptiness of the night. The trail led upward now into the tangled rocky spine of the Devil's Anvil, labyrinth of boulders and scrub brush where the shadows pooled like black water, a place where a man could hide for a day but never for a lifetime. And Malachi slowed the horse, his senses expanding, his hearing tuning out the wind to focus on the impossible quiet, listening for the snap of a twig, the scuff of a boot, or the ragged, terrified breathing of the hunted. The moon rose, a gibbous, pockmarked skull that flooded the landscape with a spectral, silver illumination, turning the cactus into twisted, grasping fingers and the rocks into crouching demons. A phantasmagoria of shapes designed to break the mind of the isolated and the guilty. Malachi saw the sign, a fresh scrape on a piece of sandstone, the lichen stripped away to reveal the raw rock. Beneath, in a grim, tightly wound satisfaction uncoiled within him, for the distance was closing, the invisible thread connecting the hunter and the prey tightening, vibrating with the tension of the impending climax. He urged Absalom forward, the horse picking its way through the debris with silent grace, moving like a phantom smoke through the defile, until the narrow canyon opened up into a small, box-ended depression, a cul-de-sac of stone from which there was no exit save the way they had come or the vertical climb up sheer walls that would defy a mountain goat. There, huddled against the base of the cliff, a dark shape against a paler stone, was the form of Elias Thorne, collapsed in the exhaustion that comes when the adrenaline finally bleeds out and leaves only the ash of despair. A figure so small and wretched against the towering majesty of the cliffs that it seemed almost a cruelty to extinguish him, yet the judge's philosophy allowed for no such sentimentality, for the law was a machine that required fuel and mercy was merely the rust that seized the gears. Malachi reined in the horse, the animal stopping instantly, and for a long stretched moment there was no movement, only the two men locked in the silent communion of the executioner and the condemned, separated by 50 yards of moonlit gravel and the infinite, unbridgeable chasm of their respective fates, until slowly, painfully, Elias began to rise, the sound of his boots scraping the rock echoing like a scream, turning to face the silhouette of the rider that loomed against the stars, a nightmare. made flesh the embodiment of the Oakhaven judgment, come to collect its due in the lonely, God-forsaken dark. The moon did not rise that night, so much as it hemorrhaged into the ink-black firmament, a swollen, necrotic eye that stared down with distinct malevolence upon the chaotic geography of the Badlands, where the final act of the drama was destined to play out, casting long, skeletal shadows that stretched across the canyon floor like the grasping fingers of the buried dead reaching up for one last taste of the air that had been denied them. Elias Thorne, his lungs burning with the fiery dust of 1,000 years of erosion, and his boots shredded to useless strips of leather by the unforgiving shale, found himself cornered in a box canyon known to the locals as the Devil's Throat, a cul-de-sac of geological malice where the walls rose vertically for 300 feet, sheer faces of sandstone that seemed to lean inward as if to better observe the slaughter, trapping the heat of the day and radiating it back in the darkness so that the air tasted of copper and old ashes. He had run until his heart battered against his ribs like a trapped bird desperate to shatter its cage. But the rhythmic, terrifyingly steady hoofbeats of the judge's pale Mari had never faltered. A metronomic drumbeat of doom that ignored the treacherous terrain with supernatural grace, closing the distance, not with speed but with the inevitability of a glacier grinding down a mountain, proving that while a man might outrun a horse, no man could outrun the weight of his own sins when they were being tallied by Malachi Thorne. When the judge finally crested the ridge and descended into the bowl of the canyon, he did not come charging with a roar of fury or the crack of a whip, but rather materialized from the gloom like a phantom coalescing from the very darkness itself, the silver concos on his saddle glinting with the cold, dead light of distant stars, and his long duster coat hanging motionless around him, despite the swirling wind, as if the elements themselves were afraid to touch him. Elias, backed against the rough, cooling stone of the canyon wall, watched with eyes wide and glistening with the madness of absolute terror as the judge dismounted, the sound of his boots hitting the hard-packed earth echoing like the tolling of a funeral bell in an empty cathedral, a heavy, deliberate sound that signaled the cessation of hope and the beginning of judgment. There were no words exchanged in that heavy, suffocating silence, for words belonged to the realm of the living, to the courtroom where pleas could be entered and lies could be spun, but out here in the raw, indifferent church of the wild, there was only the primal binary of predator and prey, the hunter and the harvested. Judge Thorne moved with a terrifying economy of motion, his face a mask of granite illuminated by the spectral moonlight, revealing deep fissures of age and resolve that looked less like wrinkles and more like the cracks in a dry river bed. His eyes devoid of anger, devoid of pity, holding only the abyssal calm of a man who believes himself to be the instrument of a higher, darker order. He did not draw the heavy iron revolver at his hip, for the bullet was a mercy of quick endings, and Malachi Thorne was not a man of mercies. Instead, he reached to the saddle horn and uncoiled the lariat, the stiff braided hemp hissing against the leather like a serpent waking from a long slumber, a sound that caused Elias to whimper, a pathetic, broken noise that was instantly swallowed by the vastness of the night. The judge approached the solitary gnarled mesquite tree that stood in the center of the canyon, a twisted, stunted thing that had clawed its life from the dry earth through sheer obstinance, and with a flick of his wrist that possessed the fluidity of a maestro conducting a symphony. A violence sent the rope soaring upwards, the loop catching a sturdy branch with a dry asterisk, thwack asterisk that sounded like a gavel striking bone. It was then, as the noose swayed gently in the stagnant air, casting a distinct and horrific shadow upon the canyon floor, that the true legend of Oakhaven was cemented, forged not in the ink of legal ledgers, but in the blood and terror of the high desert. For the judge did not rush the execution, nor did he offer a prayer for the condemned man's soul, but merely stood there, holding the other end of the rope, waiting with the patience of a statue for Elias to understand that his frantic scramble through the scrub, his desperate crawl under the sun, and his terrifying flight through the dusk had all been part of the sentence, a preamble of suffering required to balance the scales of a justice that was ancient Old Testament and entirely devoid of human softness. When the deed was finally done, and the body of Elias Thorne swung in the silent pendulum rhythm of death, his boots dancing a macabre jig 2 feet above the dust, the judge did not leave immediately, but sat upon a boulder lighting a thin cheroot the cherry red, ember glowing like a demon's eye in the dark, watching the life drain away until the struggling ceased, and the only movement was the slow rotation of the corpse in the wind. This imaged the black silhouette of the hanging man against the silver canyon walls, the stoic, unmoving figure of the judge keeping vigil, and the pale horse standing like a ghost in the periphery, burned itself into the collective consciousness of the West, a tableau of absolute authority that transcended the man himself and became a myth that whispered through the sagebrush for generations. They say that when Judge Thorne finally rode back into Oakhaven the next morning, the town was silent, the streets emptied of life as if a plague had swept through. For the people could feel the change in the air, a heaviness that radiated from the man who rode down the main thoroughfare, his duster coated in the dust of the kill, his eyes seeing through the wooden facades of the buildings to the guilty hearts beating within. He never spoke of that night, never filed a report, never acknowledged the empty cell where Elias had been kept. The rope remained on the saddle horn frayed, and darkened with use a silent testament that the courtroom was no longer confined to the four walls of the courthouse, but extended to wherever the judge's shadow fell. Over the years, Oakhaven withered, the silver mines ran dry, and the railroad bypassed the valley, leaving the town to rot in the sun like a carcass picked clean by vultures. But the legend of Malachi Thorne grew, expanding until it consumed the reality of the man, transforming him into a boogeyman used to frighten children into obedience, a spectral guardian of a brutal law that acknowledged no statute of limitations and recognized no jurisdiction but the grave. Even long after the judge had passed into the earth, himself buried, some said, with his gavel in one hand and that terrible rope in the other, travelers passing through the devil, as throat at night would report a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature, a freezing cold that penetrated the thickest wool coats, and the faint rhythmic sound of a gavel striking wood echoing off the canyon walls, followed by the creak of a rope straining under a heavy burden, a haunting reminder that while men die, legends are forged in iron and blood, and in the dark corners of the West, the court of Malachi Thorne is always in session, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to believe they can outrun the long, shadowy arm of his eternal judgment.